Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another video, and today is quite a special video. I'm going to talk about my travel/experience in Sweden. And for those of you who didn't get the information or the news yet, I went to Sweden in middle of February, a couple weeks ago, depending on when I'll publish this video. Could be a little bit longer now, and I traveled last year to Denmark and Norway. And since my channel is more based on Sweden, it's kind of funny that I didn't travel to Sweden earlier. And one thing I have to say though before is that this is not the first time that I've been to Sweden. This is my second time. But the first time I was in Sweden was just more of, how would you say, it was more of like a layover wait kind of. So I was traveling from one country and stopped in Sweden for a couple of hours, more like 6 or 7 hours. It was a pretty long wait layover, and I got to experience the city a little bit, but not too much in detail. So I wouldn't really say I was in Sweden for that long per se the first time. But this time I went specifically with the goal to actually discover and study the country a little bit more, look at some things, see the place, get to know the country, and so on and so forth. And I spent there for 4 days and was in Stockholm. That was, I guess, the first destination for me. And today I just want to give a little bit of a reflection on Sweden, because I guess that's something what most of you guys are pretty interested in. What I think of Sweden, or what I feel about it, because I've been talking so much about it, been reading the news a lot about it. We've had plenty of discussion in my post feed about Sweden, about all these political topics and so on and so forth. And there are a lot of things that I liked, honestly. And honestly, I also didn't write down anything in particular that I didn't like. So maybe there's one thing that I might say later on if something pops up in my mind. But I'll start off with the things that I liked in particular. And the first thing is the food. So if you remember how I talked about the food about in Norway or in Denmark, I liked the food in Denmark. I didn't really like the food in Norway, but that's also maybe because I didn't get to experience the cuisine in Norway that much. But in Sweden, I guess because I was in the center of the city, I was literally within walking distance. Everywhere there were restaurants, there were places. I could just literally try any food that I liked. And of course, the first thing that I tried was the köttbullar med potatis, so meatballs with potatoes. And that was very delicious. And I do have to say that each restaurant or each place has a little bit of a different way of cooking that. So the meatballs were a little bit different in every place. Potatoes were, I guess, potatoes essentially, but it also depended. It kind of depends on what sauce they add or what kind of potatoes they used, I guess. So, but that was very delicious. I had a lot of potatoes and meatballs. I don't think I've ever had this much within a span of 4 days. So that was really amazing. Loved it. And the second part that I want to talk about, or the second point, what I liked about Sweden is the fact that they're very family oriented, or also they have a very well work-life balance. At least that was my impression when I got to Stockholm. I kind of got this vibe that when I say family oriented, I mean more like I've never seen so many kids activities, so many family activities in malls, in the city, just kind of everywhere. It's kind of hard to explain when I say that family oriented. It's a very vast, broad term definition when you hear that, but at least in Switzerland, you don't really see this kind of priority for children to kind of, include children in multiple activities, families, have a lot of family discounts or things like that. In Switzerland, at least, there's not much of that, and there's not much care or priority for children or families. So that's something what I personally experienced and had this kind of impression, and I definitely liked it. And when I talk about the work-life balance in Sweden, I really could see that people aren't that super I don't want to say work-oriented, because they're also hard workers. I'm not saying that, but they also value the free time very much. There's a lot of leisure activities. You can see the Swedish people are just more laid back a little bit more relaxed. They want to enjoy some life. things like that kind of. And that's something what I also noticed and really appreciate that and really value of the Swedish people essentially. And I think that's a very good thing after all, compared to Switzerland. Now, I don't want to compare now Switzerland and Sweden the whole time, but I'm just saying what I kind of noticed some differences between where I live and where I went to. So I guess Switzerland just kind of pops up all the time after all. And now that of course comes along with the fact that the Swedish people there are very helpful, so, and very talkative as well to some extent. Well, I've heard a lot of people in Reddit comments or Quora or on the internet in general would say that, oh, Swedish people are very closed up and very introverted and very very shy and stuff like that. I mean, to some extent, yes, to some degree, but I think the other side of the coin is also that they're very helpful and very very talkative in stores. I mean, I was encountered by a few people who, like, when I was like, I kind of said, there was one example where I was saying like, oh, they don't really drink iced tea that much, well, because I couldn't find iced tea, because I just wanted to drink some iced tea in the store and I couldn't find iced tea bottles. And there was someone who was like, oh, no, but there is iced tea, like right here, kind of. So those very little tiny details, I really appreciate that, because normally people wouldn't really pay that much attention to, or things kind of like that. So I really appreciate it. And whenever you have a question or something like that, they're very helpful. And of course the English is very good, because everyone in Sweden studies English very well, and it's practically their second language after Swedish, of course. And everyone can understand you, speak English, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, the question that you might ask now is like, hey, but Alex, why didn't you speak Swedish? Why didn't you try to speak some Swedish to the people, and so on and so forth? Here's the thing with the Swedish language. In terms of reading texts and understanding the billboards, the signs, the menu cards in the stores, the tags and labels, and so on and so forth, I could understand, like, I would say 70-80% of the time. There were, of course, words and terms and sentences that I didn't understand. That's no problem. But most of the time I could understand. Now, when the people spoke Swedish, that's another thing. That's another level. And the Swedish that I listen to, usually when I study Swedish, is a bit slower. People, there are audiobooks, there are videos or podcasters who specifically speak a bit slower Swedish, so that you would understand and so that you would learn the vocabulary and the sentences and all these things. But of course, when you are in a country where people speak Swedish, they speak much faster. And also with some dialect perhaps, and with some slangs, and with some, it kind of gets a little bit more challenging for sure. And so of course I couldn't really understand fully what people would say. And there were times where I was thinking, okay, let me say something in Swedish, or let me ask something in Swedish, like, oh, can I have a menu please, or can I, what is my room, or what is your room number, or things like that. I was thinking to start saying some things in Swedish, but then the only problem would be then that they would respond in Swedish in a very fast manner, and then I would be like, oh shit, like, sorry, do you speak English, kind of, so it was kind of like that. And I didn't want to really go into that rabbit hole, so to speak. But then of course the other side is like, well, that's the only way to practice Swedish, right? Well, you have to do it. And yeah, I do admit to some extent I should have maybe still pushed myself a little bit to speak some Swedish, even though there was a chance that I wouldn't have understood everything, and then I could have asked them, could you speak slower in Swedish please, tack så mycket, and so on and so forth. Yeah, but then the other part of me was like, okay, I'm on vacation, like I just want to kind of chill a little bit. I don't want to go into this scholar mode, so to speak. If I went to Sweden with with the intention to actually study the language, then yes, I would. But the intention was actually to kind of simply explore the city and have some fun, and so on and so forth. So yeah, that's kind of that. Now, some people might ask, well, what did you do in particular in Sweden? Well, to be honest with you, the first thing I have to say is that because I went in February, very intellectual of me to some extent, but also intellectual in terms of the prices, because the plane tickets were very cheap in February, because February is not really a high peak for going to Sweden, really. I mean, who the hell goes to Sweden in February or something like that? And I was told by people that, well, why are you going in February? Like, do you have a specific reason? Are you visiting someone? And yes, I did visit some relatives, but that's not really the whole, idea of the trip. But many people told me that you should go in the summer, to visit Gamla Stan, to walk around the city and so on. Yeah, that's true. But what I did nevertheless was primarily museums, because it was very cold outside. And when I say cold outside, as a Swiss person who lives kind of near the mountains and experiences winter and cold weathers all the time, it's kind of funny to complain about the Swedish weather. But I do have to say that the air in Sweden, or at least in Stockholm, it's very cold. And aside from the fact that there was like -8 to -12 at night, and during the day -5, it was pretty damn cold. So you couldn't really walk that much outside. You couldn't really spend so much time outside, just chilling around and sitting on a bench and just looking at the nature or the city or something like that. So you were kind of forced or obliged to do more indoor activities, and museums were one of those. And what kind of museums did I visit? Well, there were two museums primarily that I visited. The one was the Nordiska Museet, which is not far from the city center. It's actually next to the Vasa Museum, if I remember. Yeah, it's next to the Vasa Museum. I didn't visit the Vasa Museum because I visited Vasa Museum the previous time when I was there the first time. So, and it wasn't, maybe one time to see it, sure, it's perfectly fine. But then seeing the Vasa Museum again the second time is kind of like, you're not really that keen on doing that again. It's just a boat, really. I'm not degrading that, but I'm just saying, like, once you've seen it, you've kind of seen it, type of thing. And the Nordiska Museet, honestly, for some of you who might want to consider visiting the Nordiska Museet, my first impression was, before visiting the museum, was like, oh, it's kind of like a museum about the Nordic history, or the Swedish history, kind of a little bit of that, some ancient things, some primitive things. And yeah, there were some of that. There was some of this historical aspect to it. But then the other part of the museum was kind of like, it was kind of half empty. Figuratively half empty, and also half rich. So what do I mean by that? The first part of the museum is very interesting. You have, from the 15th century, the 16th, 17th, 18th century, you have all these, historical items and figures and cups and all these dishes and so on and so forth. Yeah, it's very interesting. And also some of the historical aspect of the Sami people. That's very interesting. But then the other part that wasn't that interesting was more like, they had like a section of where you could see how people had their clothes worn, like in the 1950s or in the 1930s, which honestly wasn't that super interesting in my opinion. And like, I think that could have been a separate museum for fashion maybe, but I kind of expected it to be more like medieval / ancient museum for the Nordic countries or something like that. So I wasn't really super satisfied with that museum, but it's maybe one time, maybe the first time seeing it, I think I do recommend seeing it just to take a look at it. There are some things that are interesting. I'm not going to spoil everything now, but then there are some other things that, like, there was a section where you could see how people lived in the 2000s. Come on, that was like 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Like, people my age basically, and we grew up in that age basically. And it's like, really, do you need a section for early 2000s, a museum? Come on, that was like just recently, so yeah, things like that. But overall, I would say from 1 to 10, I would say like a 5, a solid 5 for sure. And then the second museum that I went to was the Viking Museum, and that was way more interesting. And Viking history in general interests me much more out of all histories, so to speak, or out of all historical periods, time periods, so to speak. And that was very interesting. I definitely recommend seeing that. The Viking Museum is not that far away from the Nordiska Museum as well. All these museums are kind of like within a walking distance of like 1 or 2 kilometers. So you could definitely, you don't have to take the public transport really if you are fit and healthy to walk a distance of 2 to 4 kilometers, really, quite frankly speaking. So definitely recommend that. So yeah, what is my conclusion for Sweden? I visited Denmark, I visited Norway, and now I visited Sweden, finally, at last. So I think out of all these 3 countries, now I'm not trying to place, put a grade on each country or something like that, but I definitely love Sweden out of all the 3 countries, and I also appreciate Norway and Denmark as well. I'm not saying that they're worse or better or anything like that, but I think maybe to some degree my bias comes into play a little bit because Sweden is kind of my prime focus, so to speak, or my prime interest. So yeah, to some degree, but it also could have been that I wouldn't have liked Sweden, and then it would have been a completely different story. And then the question would have been, well, why am I studying Swedish, stuff like that. So it was kind of expected to some extent that I would love Sweden. And yeah, I could definitely see maybe at some point in time, God wills it, or if circumstances changes, I could live in Sweden for a little bit. I would definitely imagine that. But then, of course, when you visit a country, you're maybe all lovey-dovey. It's kind of a honeymoon type of feeling that, oh, the country is so beautiful, it's so amazing. But then you oftentimes forget, okay, what's the taxes, what's the law, what's the, all these other little conditions that then come into play, and you have to consider that as well. But overall, despite that, I think I definitely recommend visiting Sweden more in warmer times, so spring or summer. Winter, I'm not saying you shouldn't visit Sweden in winter, but you should expect the winter climate to be very cold, obviously, and you're not going to spend much time outside. And this is something what I probably didn't really like or enjoy, is that I wish I could have spent some more time outside. But at some point you're gonna get frostbites and it's gonna be not so pleasant after all. So yeah, I think that's kind of that, and don't have any negative comments about Sweden. And I'm not saying that because I don't want to insult Sweden or anything of that sort, but like actually for real, like I don't have anything bad to say about my visit in particular now in that context. So yeah, I think that kind of wraps it up, and let me know what you think about that. If you've ever been to Sweden, or Swedish people, please feel free to comment on what you think about my trip or my visit. If there's something I should visit next time or not, or if I should eat something in particular. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, I'll see you in the next video.